All right, yes. Rosie ODonnell's estranged wife announced that she wants sole custody of their adopted daughter.
Yeah, and Sofia Vergara and her ex are feuding over embryos. Now, here to discuss Hollywood's high-profile custody cases is Marianne Bertuna. Welcome to the show.
Hello, and thank you so much for having me.
All right, Marianne, break it on down.
Hot topics.
Yeah.
I know, and we're going to really be seeing more and more of this now. When this all started, we saw a lot of women freezing eggs, and now with medical studies so advanced, freezing embryos has really become a popular way of women having successful childbirth. So
the law has to catch up with medicine. But let's start with an old school custody battle. So we've got Rosie ODonnell and her estranged wife. They adopted a 2-year-old girl named Dakota. Her estranged wife wants sole custody. How likely is that to happen?
Well, the courts are going to see any sort of agreements that they both had to begin with, and they're going to rely on agreements that they had when they in fact adopted their child, and that's what the courts will rely on.
But you know what, reps for Rosie say that her ex only wants custody for the money, and they say, quote, that this is an absurd and desperate attempt to use a child for their own gain. Now, could there be any validity in this?
I mean, of course, these are all emotionally charged issues, though, and I think the courts have to take that in, they do take that into consideration. But ultimately, they're going to rely on what was their agreement when they first started. What was their
if there wasn't an agreement in place? What if they, were married and they didn't have a child at that point? Because they didn't. They adopted this little girl after their marriage.
Right.
Then
well,
what?
there had to have been an agreement when they adopted the child.
Okay. So it's in regards to the adoption agreement.
That's correct.
Okay.
So the adoption agreement will come into play, and I'm sure that there was something that they both signed at the time.
Okay, let's shift gears and talk about Nick Loeb and Sofia Vergara. Okay, they have 2 embryos that are currently frozen. Nick Loeb wants to unfreeze them and bring them to full term, bring them to life. Sofia Vergara says she wants them frozen indefinitely. She's moved on to a new man, and she's happy in that relationship and doesn't want to look back. Now, Nick Loeb, does he have a leg to stand on?
Well, there are some news that states that, in fact, when they first froze the embryos, that he did say that if they were separated, that they would be thawed but not used. And I think that's going to come into play once this gets into court, because the courts are going to look at the original agreement that they both had.
Okay, but who's the legal owner of the embryos now, the mother or the father?
In reality, they both are. Because when you start this procedure, they ask that both parties agree to form some sort of an agreement to determine what will happen to these embryos if, in fact, they divorce or separate in this case.
Now, let's say that Nick Loeb is allowed to bring these children to life. Will Sofia Vergara be responsible in any way, financially, emotionally, et cetera, et cetera?
I mean, I think emotionally, there will be an emotional responsibility, but the courts, the way they handle an issue like this, if in fact, let's assume there wasn't a contract. There's some news breaking that in fact there was some sort of an agreement, but if there wasn't, the courts look back to a constitutional right to privacy. And in that constitutional right to privacy, the courts state that you can't have a state's interference with someone's right to be a parent. So they're not going to force her to be a parent. And it's more likely that, in fact, the embryos will just not be used.
All right, now let's talk about Sherri Shepherd and her ex, Lamar Sally. Now, they also had a baby via surrogate, but his sperm was used and a donated egg was used. So biologically, but she's not the mother. But still, the judge said that she is the mother. How is that possible?
Well, I think in that case, she's considered the intended mother. That's a different issue than the issue with Sofia Vergara, because in this case, she made a choice. They both made a choice. They implanted this embryo, and a child was born. And the courts are going to place responsibility on her to play a role in this child's life, as they should. And I think they're going to carefully review the 23-page contract, I believe, that was signed when they started this. They're not going to put the burden on a surrogate who really, if you listen to what she was paid, but if you hear her story, I mean, she did this to help another couple have a child. And now that they have one, I think the courts are going to impose a responsibility on her to play a role as the intended mother when she first started this whole process, which is different than the embryo, because here a child was actually born.
And it seems like there's a lot of money tied up into these cases. How lucrative could this be for the person who is the holding parent of these children?
But yeah, because there has been some allegations that the only reason Lamar Sally wants this child is so he can receive, you know, support.
Child support.
Child support, yes, from Sherri Shepherd.
I mean, that may be true, but at the end of the day, he is the only one that's taking responsibility for this child. And this child is an innocent person born into this world, and he is taking responsibility for the child. So if he's doing it for money, that's possible.
So what if she took full responsibility for the child? Would she still have to pay child support to him at all?
If she had full custody, then no.
Okay.
No, she would be the one making that claim. So
Really quickly, now say she still does not want to be a mother to this child. Could she obtain full custody and then give that child up for adoption?
she could. She could. That's always a possibility. She could. But the courts are going to impose a burden on her to take responsibility because of the contract that was signed with the surrogate. I don't think any court is going to think at any point that it was the surrogate's intention to be responsible for this child. And in fact, she's left her with this burden on her, on her.
Yeah.
So.
That's a sad situation when kids are mixed up in these legal
Yes,
battles.
I mean, these
either
are
way.
all emotionally charged issues,
Yeah.
and we have to remember at some point these two individuals wanted to have a child together, and the courts look at that, but the constitutional right will override any emotionally charged issues here.
Oh, wow.
My goodness.
Thank you for clearing all that up for us.
Thank
Don't you
you.
feel more enlightened?
I do.
I do.
It was so confusing. Thank you
Right.
so much for being here.
Thank you for having
All right,
me.
and you're watching Arise Entertainment 360.